How do you feel when you hear the sentence, I want to give you some feedback? You're probably going to feel a bit nervous, scared, and even vulnerable and not sure what to expect. Receiving feedback, especially negative feedback, is not easy. But in our working environments and in order for us to grow and further develop in our careers, it is unavoidable to receive negative feedback from time to time. So in today's video, I want to share with you 7 tips on how to get better at receiving negative feedback at work. I stumbled upon a quote from Brene Brown regarding receiving feedback from her book Dare to Lead, and I just wanted to read it out to you. She writes, "We have to be able to take feedback regardless of how it's delivered and apply it productively. We have to do this for a simple reason. Mastery requires feedback. I don't care what we're trying to master and whether we are trying to develop greatness or proficiency, but it always requires feedback." And I really love this quote because it's so true. We require feedback if we want to get better. Receiving feedback is never easy, even if it's positive. Like even with positive feedback, we tend to get a bit awkward and kind of just brush it off. Like if somebody said, "Oh, you did really well today," we're like, "Oh, that was nothing special. Oh no, I didn't do anything special." And we kind of just brush it off. So receiving feedback somehow makes us feel a bit awkward. And so how do we listen and receive feedback better and use it productively? Let's first look at what happens to us when we receive feedback. And I want to share this with an example from my own life with regards to receiving negative feedback. I still remember a situation where I received feedback and I didn't handle it in the best way. It's been probably 8 years, this one situation that still keeps haunting me a little bit to date. And I was working as a senior manager in the manufacturing industry at that time, living in Melbourne. And my boss at that time called me to deliver feedback. He didn't really prepare me. He didn't warn me. He kind of just called and said, "I want to deliver some feedback." And off he went. And he wasn't really skilled at delivering feedback well. I know that now after reflecting on it and working on providing good feedback myself. And I was not really able to sit in this discomfort of feedback and receive it well. I could feel my emotions rising. I could feel myself feeling shame. And that shame turned into frustration. That frustration turned into anger. And I became really defensive. And I really wanted to defend myself, defend my work, and find all the arguments of why he was wrong and I was right. But just in time, I remembered to take a deep breath and I said, "Thanks so much for the feedback. I need to think about this and let's talk about it again tomorrow." And this has given me the space that I needed to process this feedback. And to be honest, it's taken me the whole evening, it's taken me the whole night, and I was still very worked up. I even cried, and it really, it was really hurtful for me at that time. By the next morning, I had my emotions out, I was riding the wave of my emotions, and I woke up with a bit more clarity and with a bit more distance to this feedback. And I could see the information that he was providing, and I could start to reflect on it a little bit more effectively. And I could see that whilst it wasn't delivered in a really productive way, I could see that there were points where he was right. There were points that they actually hurt that much because they were true. And I probably have told myself this before. The things that we get criticized on that ring true for ourselves or that we criticize ourselves for often hurt the most and make us the most defensive. But I was able to see his points and really take it on board and think about how I could implement this and what changes I could make. But with feedback, the issue is that like in this situation, like in my story, you don't have control over who delivers the feedback, and you don't necessarily have control over how well they do this and how well they prepare themselves and yourself for this conversation. And so we need to help ourselves and support ourselves to receive feedback better and be able to distance ourselves from the feedback. So here are 7 tips that I want you to remember and start to implement to help you receive and manage negative feedback better. Tip number 1, feedback is subjective. Everyone has their own belief systems, their values, their experiences, their own frame of reference that they base their feedback on. They look at your work or what you do and say and judge it based on their parameters that they know. Feedback is never fully objective. It's always based on your frame of reference or their frame of reference. And so I think this is really important to keep in mind. There's not just this one truth. There's always different versions of the truth, and this is really important to keep in mind. Tip number 2, you get to choose who you accept feedback from. Not everyone is allowed to just blurt out their feedback. You don't have to accept feedback and take it for granted from anyone and everyone. You get to choose who you want want to listen to. You get to choose whether this is a person that you look up to, that you can learn from, and that you are interested in their point of view. Of course, in a working environment, we might have managers or more senior people above us that will provide us with feedback. And of course, you kind of have to listen. And it's also important because there's always something important there for you to learn. But you get to choose, you get to decide what feedback you want to take on board. Just because they share it with you does not mean that you have to take everything on board and that you have to listen to everything that they say. Tip number 3 is to stay open-minded. When somebody shares feedback with you, and even if you disagree straight away, and if you think in your mind, oh my God, that's not true, never, I have a total different view, stay open-minded, because whatever information somebody else shares with you is really valuable information for you to reflect on and improve. There's always something that you can take from that, because when we want to improve our self-awareness, we also want to understand what the external self-awareness is like. So we want to build our external self-awareness to understand how are people perceiving us and our actions and what we do. Where are we selling ourselves the way that we want to be seen? And where are there misunderstandings, or where are we maybe not portraying ourselves in the way that we want to? Stay open-minded and always just look for the information that is valuable to you, because there's always something you can take from feedback. And if needed, ask for more details. You can say, oh, thanks so much for sharing this with me. That's very interesting. I also feel like there are opportunities for me to improve, but could you share a few more details or more specific examples of situations where you've observed me doing X, Y, Z? This way you can make sure that they are very specific and that you don't get just general feedback that is not really useful for you, and you get feedback that's specific to situations, because only then you can actually take it on board and do something about it. Tip number 4 is treat feedback as information. Feedback is just information. It's neither true or false or good or bad. It's just information. And that helps you to take a bit of a distance between yourself and the feedback and look at it with a more neutral lens. Start to look at the information and then decide what is useful for you. But just reminding yourself, it's just information. It doesn't harm me. It doesn't hurt me. It doesn't need to do anything. And looking at it like that will be really helpful. Tip number 5 is that you want to practice self-regulation. You can't necessarily control who gives you feedback and how well they are equipped to providing feedback. You also can't always control the time frame or the time and place somebody provides you with feedback. And you can't necessarily control your first reaction. When somebody says, I want to share some feedback with you, your natural response might to feel a bit threatened or scared or worried or nervous. And that's totally normal. You can't necessarily control your first response, but you can control what happens after. How much you let your emotions control what you say and do afterwards. When you get feedback, you want to take a deep breath before you respond. And if you feel like you're not able to self-regulate in the moment, if you feel like you're getting too overwhelmed or getting too far down the shame spiral, then you can always say, thank you so much. Can we talk about it again tomorrow? You can always ask to postpone the conversation so that you can get some time and space to think about it and to self-regulate yourself. Because remember, whilst you are in the heat of the moment and feeling really strong emotions, you actually are not able to think rationally about what you're hearing. And so you always want to make sure that you have moved through your emotions before you actually think and act on that feedback. And this also leads really well into tip number 6. Give yourself time. Give yourself time to reflect and digest the feedback. You do not have to respond straight away. You do not have to come up with solutions straight away. You also do not have to change anything straight away. Give yourself time and space to think about it, reflect on the information, and then decide which bits of it do you really want to take on board and act on. What are the things that you think will be most helpful and useful for you to implement? And so time is really important, because only then can we start to look at it more rationally and really make the best decisions. If you need time and space, if you need time to self-regulate and think about the feedback, then you can always say, thank you so much for the feedback. This is really important for me to understand, and I appreciate that you shared this with me. But I also would like to have some time to think about it and reflect about it before we discuss any further actions or discuss any more points. That's totally okay. And lastly, tip number 7 is to work on your self-confidence. The more you trust yourself, the more you believe in yourself, the easier it is for you to receive feedback. If we are trapped in a spiral of self-doubt and negative self-talk, of course, everything somebody else we criticize or any feedback that we hear will just make it worse and will just reinforce this negative self-belief that we have about ourselves. So reflect on your strength. Reflect on what are the key things that you have that you can contribute. What are the things that you do really well? And also start to create a ta-da list, a list where you collect your achievements, big or small, all your success stories throughout the year, and regularly look at this list to remind yourself of all the amazing things you've already accomplished. Because you have something great to share, and the more you believe this yourself and trust yourself, easier it is to accept feedback and to work on our weaknesses and blind spots. So these were my 7 tips to help you navigate and manage negative feedback more effectively and productively. And if you want more help specifically to manage your emotional responses and manage your emotional reactions, then make sure you watch this video next.